All right, welcome everyone to this event in our 2025-2026 study series on the theme Study War No More. Tonight we are meeting on the subject of hopeful resistance through global solidarity with two wonderful scholars of resistance and peace from around the world. I first want to just welcome everyone and invite you all to introduce yourselves to one another in the chat. We've kind of done that amongst ourselves already, but please feel free to do that in the chat. Introduce yourself with your name and pronouns and where you're calling from. And I also would love to just give a little bit of framing for this event and why we chose to talk about this subject amidst this theme of Study War No More, which this year we are thinking about in community to understand the Christian response, how we are called as Christians to respond to war and violence sort of expansively, and how that shows up in our cultures and in our everyday lives, and then how we resist that too and create cultures of peace. So we came to this event, to this topic, thinking about how to counter rising authoritarianism, violence, and especially the narrative of Christian nationalism and exceptionalism that drives these challenges in US society. These challenges are unique to the US, but also very similar to those faced in places around the world. So it is imperative for our movement to learn from people around the world facing similar issues to our own. It's been a tradition within the US student Christian movement to learn from our siblings around the world, to open our eyes to new political realities and new strategies. When we turn our gaze outward, we are reminded that we are not alone in our resistance to these forces, and nor are we alone in our hope for a better future. We can learn strategies and build hope and power through solidarity with movements around the world and at home. So Nathan and I just returned last week from a transformational trip to occupied Palestine, where this message was clear as we learned from activists, community leaders, and everyday Palestinians about resisting oppression and occupation steadfastly. And as we watched scenes from Minneapolis unfold on our screens in Palestine, the importance of learning from our global siblings about the connections of empire and resistance was really reinforced for us. So this conversation is coming at a very timely moment, I think, for those of us in the US and people around the world. So just to give a little rundown of what we're going to do over the next 50 minutes or so, I will introduce our first speaker, Dr. Dongjin Kim, and then he will give a short presentation, and then I will introduce Nathan Samayo, and he will also give a short presentation. We'll have some moderated conversation and then open it up to your questions. So without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker. Dr. Dongjin Kim is the Kim Dae-jung Chair Professor of Peace Studies at Hanshin University and the ISE Adjunct Professor in Peace and Reconciliation at the School of Religion, Theology, and Peace Studies at the Trinity College in Dublin. He conducts engaged research, collaborating with various humanitarian, development, and peace organizations, including Ok Dongmu Children in Korea, Korean Sharing Movement, and the Korean community in Ireland. He was a Goodwill Ambassador for Peace on the Korean Peninsula at the South Korean Ministry of Unification from 2020 to 2022, and he is the author of numerous books and articles on peace, conflict, and reconciliation. I am thrilled to welcome Dr. Dongjin Kim to speak to us about hopeful peace.
Um, Thank you so much, Ellie, for the kind invitation and for bringing us together. So let me share a screen. So I have a few slides, if I may. Um, so hopefully, okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Great,
Yes, we can
great,
see it.
perfect. Thank you. So I just want to use these few minutes to reflect on peace as something that must be hopeful and to think about how hope emerges through what I call a translocal perspective. That is, when people rooted in different local struggles encounter one another in solidarity. I've been thinking about hope and peace for a long time, particularly because of where I come from. I'm originally from South Korea, a country still divided by an unfinished war. The Korean Peninsula is divided physically, but also psychologically, emotionally, and socially. And in divided and conflict-affected societies, something very particular happens. Anxiety, fear, and apprehension towards the different other becomes normal. And these societies tend to narrow our identities, pushing us into a single dominant identity, often a national, ideological, or security-based one. All our other identities, being a parent, a neighbor, a person of faith, a worker, a friend, get trapped inside that dominant frame. This narrowing can feel seductive. It promises protection and security, but securing ourselves against an ever-present threat is not a very peaceful way to live. It's exhausting and it's deceptive. About a decade ago, I moved from Korea to Ireland, another place deeply shaped by division and conflict. I later returned to Korea, but I remain deeply connected to Ireland and to many other conflict-affected societies where I've worked in solidarity. What I began to notice is this: international actors are often primarily concerned about other people's conflicts. Local actors, understandably, are primarily concerned about their own. And even when we cross borders in solidarity, we don't leave our own histories and context behind. I couldn't turn off my Korean experience and my Korean engine in my brain, and my Irish, South African, Cambodian, Colombian, Palestinians or American colleagues couldn't turn theirs off either. So we began asking what happens when locals meet locals from different places? What kind of space opens up then? That for me is where translocal begins. One of the dangers of being deeply embedded in a single context is that we can become trapped by it. Our imagination shrinks. The present begins to feel permanent. Hope, in contrast, is not denial. It's not naive optimism. Hope is the capacity to imagine something beyond what currently exists. In sociology, this is called the sociological imagination, the ability to connect personal experience with wider social and historical forces. In theology, it's been called the prophetic imagination, the courage to imagine alternatives to the single future that power insists is the only possible one. And in peace studies, John Paul Lederach describes it as the capacity to generate responses that are rooted in daily realities of violence, but that still transcend and break destructive cycles. I've come to believe that this imagination is often nurtured between places, not just within them. This is where hope becomes deeply connected to human agency. Peace is too often discussed only in terms of states, institutions, and structures, national interests, security doctrines, and geopolitical struggles. But peace studies reminds us that people, even under oppressive systems, still have agency. And crucially, peace emerges when we take seriously forms of knowledge that have long been marginalized: local, indigenous, spiritual, feminist, queer, colonized ways of knowing. Hope lives there. Let me share a brief example through the lens of children. Under South Korea's military dictatorship, when I was young, I grew up under the South Korean military dictatorship. Children were encouraged to draw North Koreans as rat devils with horns. There were even national competitions for this. That was the imagination being restricted, and dehumanization was normalized in the name of national security. So some of us asked a very simple question. What if children drew themselves instead simply as human beings and sent those drawings to children in North Korea? The messages were incredibly simple. I want to play football with you. I want to dance with you. I want to be your friends. And those drawings were reciprocated. And during the peace process of the Korean Peninsula, this eventually led to actual visits, South Korean children meeting North Korean children, exchanging portraits and letters. But when political peace process was collapsed in 2010, these spaces were shut down. Hatred was once again enforced from above. Children were told not to imagine friendship. When I later moved to Ireland, I brought these drawings with me to Northern Ireland in particular. Young people there across deep divides looked at them and asked very sharp questions. Why can't these children meet again? Who decided they were enemies? Why do adults make these rules? Through Korea, they began to reimagine their own future. From there, the drawings traveled to South Africa, where apartheid has formally ended, but structural division and inequality remain deeply entrenched, and then to the United States, a country long seen as a global peace builder, now struggling with intense internal polarization and violence, and eventually to Colombia, Cambodia, and other places affected by protracted conflict. And children are not perfect. We just have to admit they can be annoying too. But children are often, you know, the people who can see the artificial nature of protracted conflict more clearly than adults do. They remind us of something very basic, to be human together. Last November, we gathered these drawings at the United Nations headquarters to remind the UN that it is a club of states, of course, but it was created by people in a moment of deep despair to prevent another world war. That kind of imagination is deeply and desperately needed again. In a world where powerful systems keep insisting on narrow, fearful versions of reality, we need hope, not as a feeling, but as practice. We need sociological imagination, prophetic imagination, peace imagination, and very often that imagination is sustained through translocal solidarity when we dare to see one another not as distant others, but as companions in becoming human together. So thank you very much. I really look forward to the conversation with all of you, especially Nate.
Thank you so much, Dongjin. That was a really wonderful introduction to these ideas of hopeful peace and translocality. And it's wonderful to see drawing hope as the example. I was so honored to be at the opening of Drawing Hope at the UN, and it was really moving to see the way that all of these societies, all these children have come together to do the work of imagining peace for their own own communities and own worlds that they live in. All right, so now I will introduce our next speaker. Nathan Samayo is from Guam and Tacoma, Washington, and is a current religion PhD student at Princeton Theological Seminary. His research examines Indigenous sovereignty and ecological sustainability amidst 21st century Pacific Rim geopolitics. Nathan was a member of the inaugural WSCF US student leadership team. And we are so happy to have Nathan here presenting his research.
Awesome. Thanks, y'all. And Dongjin, that was thank you for that note. I feel like I'm gonna make a little bit of a sour turn in terms of current conditions going on right now in the Micronesian island region. I just want to drop an article actually, and this is really just kind of a simple breakdown of issues surrounding indigenous sovereignty in the Pacific at the moment, particularly in Guam. That was actually a co-authored essay with a historian that I'm friends with and also an activist who's currently doing an anti-military development movement right now in Guam. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Actually, I have a couple slides. That's okay. And then hopefully I would love to just have, discussion after this. I'm going to keep this pretty brief. Can you see my screen there? Is that okay? Does that work? Okay,
Yes, we
perfect.
can see it.
I'm going to hit play or slide. Let's see. Of course I'm having tech problems now.
I
Oh,
think if
view.
you go
Okay,
to slide,
slideshow.
yeah,
Oh,
there you go.
perfect. Okay, cool. So this is an image drawn by someone in the movement called Life at the Tip of the Spear. And there's been this saying since World War II that Guam is the tip of the American spear in terms of, the US says that they're in a defensive posture when it comes to East Asian aggression, is how they would phrase it. But, we're well aware that the US often plays an offensive posture when it comes to 21st century geopolitics and even throughout the 20th century. Coming from the perspective of someone from Guam, the biggest you know, overarching issue is one about sovereignty, which can ultimately be boiled down to having self-determination over your own economic and political activity and the material conditions of your own people. And, this has been an issue in Guam since Spanish colonialism, starting the 16th century. But in terms of being a part of the US body politic, the US usurped or quasi-annexed Guam, Puerto Rico, Cuba provisionally, and the Philippines in 1898, and then stamped them with this political status called unincorporated territory, which essentially argued that, and I'll speak from the perspective of Guam, that Guam is a part of the US. Excuse me, they're a possession of the US, but they're not a part of the US, and that they're not on the pathway to statehood, and therefore they do not have full constitutional protections. And those constitutional protections include voting delegation, both on national and international platforms, including Congress and the United Nations. So overall, people in Guam don't have voting rights when it comes to anything federal or on the international level. And this makes it extremely challenging when it comes to resisting US military developments, particularly in the 21st century. And that's kind of just what I want to talk about now in terms of um, current military developments. I'm going to kind of summarize this, but essentially, in 2006, the US and Japan had this agreement. Let me take a step back. So, in 1996, after decades of local resistance in Okinawa surrounding this one Marine Corps base that was very contentious in the local community because of heightened rates of crime, in 1995, and a trigger warning when it comes to sexual assault, there was this big sexual assault case that happened in Okinawa where three US military personnel ultimately sexually assaulted a minor. And that caught international headlines. And then in 1996, the US made a public declaration that they're going to demilitarize from Okinawa. Now, 10 years later, in 2006, the US and Japan made this public agreement that they're ultimately going to demilitarize Okinawa, which arguably did not happen, but they're going to move those military personnel to Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands, which is this island archipelago that includes Guam and then other islands, including Saipan, Tinian, and Rota. Yeah, and so part of that 2006 plan was to move all those military personnel to Guam. And then starting 2010, they announced that they were going to build this huge missile defense system in Guam that was going to be pointed towards China, North Korea, and Russia, arguing that the US is engaged with them in a global nuclear arms race. So that's kind of the political rhetoric that is kind of proliferating Western Pacific geopolitics. Now, as part of Trump's militarization plans, he is currently working on building a $175 billion missile defense system that is plotted in Guam and pointed towards China, North Korea, and Russia, which you can see on the bottom left of the screen here. And if you, bringing this to an international perspective, in 2021, they built the first prototype of this missile defense system. And it was actually a borrowed missile defense system that was developed in Israel and tested in Gaza. And then they plotted that Iron Dome battery in Guam in 2021 to test missiles. And that uh, experiment, which was termed Operation Iron Island, was deemed successful. And that was kind of the launch to developing this $175 billion missile defense system that's called the Golden Dome. That's set to be complete in 2028. And there's all these contracts that Trump is involved in with Amazon and SpaceX, so Elon Musk, who are interested in being kind of the project director of this missile defense system that the US is building right now, pointed towards East Asia. So that's essentially what's going on right now in terms of Western Pacific geopolitics. I'm happy to clarify anything because I know I kind of oscillated between, time periods and different types of projects. Let's see. Perfect.
Thanks so much for that presentation about the geopolitics of our own country that most people do not know. And yeah, we'll hopefully get to hear a bit more from you about the movements and the resistance as we move into this moderated portion of the conversation. So I have a few questions for Nate and Dongjin about their work and how they envision these concepts coming into our lives and our movements. So I will ask those questions and we'll hear their conversation, and then I will open it up to all of your questions and a broader conversation. So my first question for Nate and Dongjin is I would love for you both to speak about a time when translocal connections enhance the strategies and strength of the movements that you've been a part of in South Korea and Guam or beyond.
Can go ahead and jump
Nate,
in.
Nate,
Yeah,
no,
I
please.
just, yeah, no, this was a great question. And, I think part of it is the fact that Guam is inherently translocal. And part of this is because, so within kind of movement spaces in Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands, which is the island archipelago, there is this idea that some activists have been using called scaling. And scaling is a good rule of thumb to use when you ultimately want to assess if a movement was successful or not. Now, what does that mean? Now, let's take the image of Okinawa, for example, that the US wanted to demilitarize Okinawa. Now, if they actually shut down a military base, that would be deemed successful. But if you were to scale on on a translocal or even international level, you want to ask the question, by this happening, did this ultimately divert or divert the harm being produced somewhere else? If the answer is yes, then we got to reconsider if the movement was actually successful. Because the goal of, demilitarization or demilitarization or decolonization is to make sure that the harm ceases from being reproduced elsewhere. And so scaling is a way to see if a local movement was actually successful by making sure that the harm wasn't put onto another community. Yeah, I just wanted to throw that out as like a rule of thumb to think about translocality. I hope that makes sense.
It does, Nate. This is a fantastic example. And also, I mean, in my context, when I was listening to you, I couldn't really help but thinking about Jeju Island, which is also very deeply affected. And I work with St. Francisco Peace Center there in Jeju, where the Catholic priest said mass every single day in front of the naval base being constructed to block the gate, at least for those time of the sort of the Catholic mass every day for a couple of hours. Um, but then, of course, that when it was built, then and actually again, that it was decided during the time of the Liberal government in South Korea in negotiation with Bush administration in USA, when it was presented to the local villagers, that it was presented as something really for the national defense as well as something good for the local villager. But eventually, when the base was constructed, then it actually was really harmful. It became really harmful for the local environment and all this, the life of the villagers. And then even though that the government promised that it's only for the South Korean and navies, but now that we are having the nuclear submarines from the US as coming over and all this, so it's being used by the US military as well. So all this sort of the protest from the local people, I mean, their sort of the claim was being confirmed as truth, but then not many people are sort of taking an interest in this, and we had the solidarity from the people in Hanoko, in Okinawa, and also from Guam. And many took an interest in terms of this situation because they were facing the same dilemma, by themselves. And then sometimes because of this security rhetorics, they're so dominant in every societies, and especially when you're thinking about sort of the national interest containing China or North Korea, and then all of those things and the life of the local people are being really diminished they're putting into the boxes in the name of the greater defense. And again, Rocky Martin, I noticed the company from your slides, and then there are other things going on in terms of the sort of the business interest, and then all of those the ideas. But what we are trying to do translocally this year is that to create a kind of a people's tribunal on these islands and peninsulas and from West Asia, as in Palestine, to Northeast Asia and South Pacific areas, to sort of see where these people are being really affected because of the breakdown of these peace processes along the line. And then so from our perspective as Koreans, and then we would see that how oftentimes whenever the locals are having these moments of a certain breakthroughs in terms of peace building, for example, or peace process. And somewhere or the other, we realize that even though that we have this local desire, I mean, every context are very different. Like in our case, it's the division of the Korean Peninsula, right? And sometimes then it's about self-determination of the people. And then all of this desire to have nation states and then their own space for themselves and lands and territory, all these issues suddenly becomes really contentious because of the experience from others and also the interest from other countries coming together. And it's very difficult for the local people to really understand and not being influenced by all these other things when you are in the box, sis, against your own people. And then there's also the struggles going on. So we really want sort of need one another to expose all these structural sort of issues surrounding us. Otherwise, our imagination about the situation and historical nature of the things happening, and then the interconnection to the wider the connections are not very visible because we are trapped, as in my case, like south or north, you know. or Japan or Korea, all these boxes. So this is kind of the merit of sort of translocal perspective, how we could really learn together about the situation where we could really see the dots altogether. And in my case, and then sometimes when you're looking at completely different context, like in Ireland, it also gives kind of an inspiration. And then how this sort of difficult challenge could really give us some space to think about our own. And in Korea, like I was quite struck by what Nate was talking about, um, sort of potentially sort of contested or um, controversial sort of narratives coming out of the region, and then it's a security issue as well. But sometimes whenever I am talking about North Korea, I've been sort of depicted or described as North Korea sympathizer, even though I don't I don't sympathize with North Korean regime at all. And then some people say that if you like North Korea so much, go live there. I don't want to go live there. I don't like dictatorship. That's not what I want. However, I want reconciliation on the Korean Peninsula. All my grandparents were from North Korea. They were internally displaced during the wartime. And that's my desire. And then if the Korean Peninsula and not necessarily political unification or have achieved reconciliation, we wouldn't be manipulated by the external forces to have the military base and all of these things happening. So that's what I want. But that if I say it like that in my own context, I've been, put into the box like betrayer to your own community and all of the other things. So I talk about Ireland. Look at Ireland, the Irish situation, and I sometimes I create space in the sort of the kind of the generous sort of welcoming from the Irish sort of narratives and stories, where it even though that it's a completely different situation, we could see some common human elements in it. So I talk about Ireland a lot in Korea. I think that's sometimes helpful as well.
Thank you both for those reflections. That was, I think that illustrates the idea of translocality perfectly there in that conversation. The way that you were both drawing connections to so many different places and so many different experiences that are similar and different and informing one another and illuminating one another. So thank you both. So I want to move back to this idea of hopeful peace. And in conversations with friends right now in the US, we've been talking a little bit, and also on our recent trip to Palestine, we talked about how it's a common sort of liberal impulse to move quickly to hopeful attitudes in times of political upheaval or harm or those sorts of things. So, how does this idea of hopeful peace and hopeful imagination, prophetic imagination, help us to hold lament and realistic understandings of what's happening in the world alongside a hopeful vision for the future?
Man, I think I'll jump in here with just two small remarks. And again, I'm happy to answer questions to clarify anything. I think also part of this was a question about like a democracy or the future of democracy. And, coming from an indigenous perspective, the question is, the US is not a democracy, it's an empire. And so they don't rule by coming from an indigenous perspective, they don't rule by the consent of the governed, right? They rule from conquest. And so, once Pacific Islanders can have sovereignty over their own material conditions and just um, uh, being able to define, I'm forgetting what the phrase is, but basically wellness of life or how they experience wellness in life, then we can have a conversation about democracy. Now, just one other thing I want to just throw in here, and this might just open Pandora's box, but I also want to talk about how peace is understood within the category of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, which is a category that I don't subscribe to, and I think is actually quite a reckless category. I think that within the US, political history, there have been times in which Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders have, collaborated for resistance or advocacy or solidarity. But the truth of the matter is that we have very different political demands. Asian Americans, this is going to be kind of contentious, but a lot of them ultimately seek representation within a liberal, multicultural state. But Pacific Islanders, in terms of on the leftist side of the spectrum, want decolonization. This is captured in the quote that says the difference between Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders is that we didn't come to the empire came to us. So I just want to kind of leave it like that. And there's a lot of complications and implications of a statement like that, but I just want to leave that. Maybe we can talk further. I'll pass this on to Dongjin too.
Sure. Thank you, Nate, for your reflection. And perhaps I could sort of delve into kind of the nature of sort of peace in our conception, like I'm in peace studies. So our main critiques of peace is it's often being understood as kind of a state of tranquility, like this it is what it is, and then you just have to embrace it and accept it, and then if you don't do anything then it's peaceful. Sometimes people think of it in such a way, and then Johan Galtung is kind of the forefather figure of peace studies. He calls it negative peace, like an absence of physical violence, and yet you feel somehow this violence, and then but you don't really know where to sort of pinpoint the nature of this violence coming onto you. So Johan Galton calls it structural violence. He coined it, and then he coined sort of cultural violence as well, as in the justification mechanisms of structural and physical violence, and we are quite familiar with all these terms now. But in terms of sort of this conceptualization of peace between positive and negative peace, and then I don't think that it's just about kind of the valuation or evaluation of certain status. And then I think, peace is inherently contentious. And I think it's like what you're saying, that we all have a different perspectives and perception, grounded our own context. I think that's what matters. But in our own context, and then because of this inherent violence that we feel, particularly in conflict-affected societies, and then we want change. That is a problem. And then, the change, whether it's peaceful or violent, are all threats to the current status quo, right? So that it becomes problem to the people who have power. So again, that whether it's violent or peaceful, so they want a status quo, and they just want to maintain the situation as it is, because that's where you get all the benefits, from my perspectives. So inherently, I think, in terms of the power relations, that you want to see the situation as it is, yeah. And then there are people who want peace, again, that whichever way that you want change, and that's where kind of the struggles begin. And then in terms of hope, for me, hope is not just a feeling or aspiration or something kind of a wistful thinking, or even optimism. It's not just about the way in which that we see, oh, whenever the peace process is going on, when the South Koreans and North Koreans are in the Olympic together, and we are hopeful. And that's not what I define hope. Hope is kind not just about the wistful sort of thinking, but it's really kind of something gives us motivation to act on certain things when uh, even when we are in despair and we are frustrated, and then there is a margin of sort of the chances, slim odds to be there, because we know first, that this is something that we want, we have the desire. And then secondly, we see the glimpse of it. So it's already there, like in the local community, in indigenous communities. And then we see the different way of living possible, right? And then we want, but it's not yet there. So it's already here, but not yet, just like the reign of God. So prophets, they were able to sort of see all these dimension and see kind of the reign of God already here, but not yet. So I think that's what I call hope. So it's an ongoing process of becoming. Like it's not yet. So if we have that, we can always sort of make change all the time. And even though that there is a threat from the powerful sort of, whether we call the people or the groups or the structures, but we constantly challenge that, as in the form of resistance or as in the form of building peace. So that's what I define hopeful peace, if it's okay.
Thank you. That was, I feel like I'm going to be thinking about that for a long time. The reign of God is here, but not yet. And that is what hope is for, or maybe that's one place that we can take hope as, especially as a student Christian movement in this time in the US and in the world, to say, I love the part about not yet. Yes, acknowledging it's not yet here, but God is here with us too. Um, so I want to move to our last question and then open it up to everyone else. I wonder if both of you could offer a couple of ways that students and young Christians can contribute to the broader movement, uh, contribute some unique leadership to a broader movement, um, recognizing that maybe we have some different goals. So whether that's protecting democracy or in decolonization movements, or building hopeful peace wherever their local context is.
Maybe I could go first here because I am slightly older than Nate, perhaps. So maybe I am in disadvantage here. Maybe I could go first. You know that I've shown you the drawings from young people. They are mostly at the age of like 12 to 14 or 15. So they are quite young. Uh, but the beauty of working with these young people are they are in between. They're really in between. So they are being forced to put into boxes. In the Korean term, they are pre-military service age. So mostly the Korean men, the half of the population are being trained as a potential killing machine when they turned 20. You've been to Palestine, and the situation in Israel would be the same for both genders, the across the genders and all that. But in our situation, these young people are in the school and in society in the name of socialization to become good South Korean citizen, and they are being asked to do certain things to behave, right? And as a responsible adults. Yeah. But in between of their age, and then they could sort of still tap into the time where they could be kind of freer. Like people could say that, oh, they're children, so let them be, just like Jesus said. And then you have certain freedom as a child or children, because people can sort of be understanding, oh, they don't know yet, you know. But when they don't know yet, and then they can sort of say very strange things, some innocent things to some extent, but then it challenges again the existing structure. And then sometimes it's really scary and then dangerous. And then these are the things that the young people could really do from my perspectives. And then I don't like the phrase like young people, then the future generation or next generations are our future. You know, I don't think that is the case. I think the younger generations and young people are our present, and then I think they should be our teacher, and we desperately need their help. We desperately need help from younger generations, and then to show the kind of the natural way of living as human being. I'm not necessarily saying that. I mean, I don't want to put them on a pedestal like younger generations. Again, that as I was saying, that they can be unknowing, really, like selfish too. But that's not what I meant. Sort of, the learning that we can draw from their life is that they can show the glimpse of the life without these boxes, without securitization of those boxes even, or identities. And then you can just you can just be happy, and then just, but then adults are ruining their lives in the name of drawing artificial nature of the lines, sometimes visible or sometimes invisible, and all of those things. But then they can challenge that as in the name of being a child. So I don't, I want to distinguish sort of being childish and a childlike, and then I really want to be a child again, to be courageous, to challenge. So I hope that answered your question.
Thanks, Dongjin. It kind of this relates to I think what I wanted to share. It's just like a final thought around imagination. It sounds like. So when Ailey and I came back, we left Palestine and we all regrouped in Jordan. And this was the last night that our delegation was sitting around the dinner table, and we were talking about ways that we, call to actions after we were in Palestine and what all these churches and organizations were telling us that we can be in solidarity with them internationally. And the conversation of divestment came up, right? And so many people are talking about divestment right now. Not a lot of people are on the same page about what divestment means. And I reflected back on this talk that I listened into. This was shortly after October 7th in 2023, when divestment started coming, kind of resurfacing on a more kind of public level. And this economist, he said, to divest from Israel essentially means that you're divesting from the global economy just because of how much Israel is invested in the global economy. And he says divestment is one aspect of the movement, but ultimately, this movement is asking us to ponder what a nonviolent life looks like, right? What does it mean to not invest in violent ways of existence? And that's both, you can look at that economically, politically, but really the question is, how do we live a life that is nonviolent? And again, nonviolent doesn't mean non-action. Um, but what are ways that we can think of nonviolent as a way of being? That's kind of what I hope that kind of, I just want to tie in our trip to Palestine to this conversation. And I'm left with the question, how do I reorient myself into a nonviolent way of existence? I know that sounds kind of meta, but it's something that I'm pondering right now. I hope that answers the question, Ailey. And thank you, Dungeon.
Yeah, thanks, Nate. I think it's very relevant to bring it to that conversation that we were having. And I think it gets to what Dongjin was saying too about um, because young people, children don't have the same boxes that adults do, we can sort of imagine a different way of living, whereas some people are very just stuck in the way that the world is with these violent systems and violent ways of living. Um, New imaginations can offer a different way, and maybe usher us into some nonviolent ways of life. Um, Thank you both so much for answering those questions and for engaging in this conversation. I know we're getting close to the hour, but I did want to open it up to other questions from folks in the audience. Uh, I hope that this conversation has sparked some thoughts. I know it has for me. So, yeah, give a chance for other people to ask a couple questions and then um, we can wrap things up. But first, open it up. If you want to raise your hand, either just physically like this, we're all on the screen together, so that might work, or use the Zoom function. Matt, go ahead.
I just want to thank you both for presenting, and specifically Nathan. It's very interesting to hear about Guam and the context of the Golden Dome and how that relates um, to Israel. And I had recently just watched a YouTube video on the Northern Mariana Islands, and it's like these travel vloggers that I like to watch called Yes Theory. I'm wearing their merch. Wow, that's funny. Anyway, they went to the Northern Mariana Islands and Guam, and they went to the base where the Enola Gay took off for dropping of the atomic bomb. So to put it into that context of the start of that type of American imperialism, I mean, obviously it was before that, but that big context, that big thing in time that shifted militarization as we know it, um, it made me think about how that happened back then and how it's still happening today in the same place. Um, so it made me want to learn more. And I also have this question. I had two questions that came to mind. How is it affecting the village that you were talking about? And also, are there plans for the US to quote unquote sell its defense? Like if the US is just defending the US, or if we're going to be making treaties with other countries around us to, have that dome be defense for our neighbors, if that's even an option.
That's a great question, man. I'm gonna try to kind of keep everything concise here, hopefully. Yeah, just to, add on top of what Matt's talking about, the bomb that was dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki was launched from the island of Tinian, or at least it was carried from the island of Tinian and dropped in Japan. Um, they're actually revamping that base now as part of a machine gun testing site. Actually, that's part of this military reposturing in the Western Pacific. Um, in terms of the village of Texan, long story short, that village was is stolen land in 1963. So the U.S. went in after they recaptured Guam from the Japanese Imperial Army, and they created this legal mechanism called eminent domain, which basically argues, and I'm sure a lot of folks are familiar with this, which basically argues is that if the U.S. federal government needs your land or the military for any kind of military operation, they can just take it from you and then they would compensate you how much the land is worth. And this was actually a legal mechanism that the Navy deployed in order to take up to 60% of the land in Guam in the 1960s. And so that land where a machine gun testing site is now built on, Le Texan, um, was stolen in 1963. And it sits on top of a water aquifer that gives 90% of the island residents fresh drinking water, which now is poisoned. And so there's stories of cancer, people getting cancer in the 1990s, children dying because of cancer due to water toxification in Guam. And so, yeah, there's a whole host of issues that come from building machine gun testing sites and this missile defense system. In terms of defending other uh, countries, that's maybe I can follow up with you on that just because there's so many different contingencies involved in what that might look like. Um, yeah, but it's
Yeah,
tough.
I just see us using that as leverage in the future. Hey, you want protection?
Yeah, it used to be US aid, but now that US aid was cut, they replaced what they call soft power, which is basically diplomacy, with hard power, which is militarization, which is a wild phenomenon to think of. But I'm happy to talk with you more about that. It's fascinating and very scary. Go ahead, Dog Jin, please. Any thoughts about that?
I'll be very I'll try to be brief. Uh, so okay, I'll try my best to be concise and brief. In the Korean context, U.S. militaries are there in the name of defense against the threat from North Korea, right? And then that's different from the defense agreement with Japan. And then Korea in particular, I mean, many people believe that the U.S. military are there in the name of defense, not necessarily for the strategic sort of interest of the United States. However, there is a battery called THAAD battery in South Korea. It's a terminal high altitude area defense system. So called missile defense means MD, and it's creating huge problems in South Korea. But they're there, and then it's controversial, as though that the U.S. military is saying that it's to sort of to defense against the missile threats from North Korea. And then Lockheed Martin, who created this system, boast 9 out of 15 success rates in terms of shooting down those missiles. 9 out of 15. Where the six go, then that's what you say in a controlled environment, and 9 out of 15. So, but then mostly, in terms of the border between North and South Korea, it's very close. So why would you need that MD system? And people suspect that it's because of the radar system that it has, which could overlook the whole sort of the Chinese continent. Like that's kind of but it's causing lots of problems for the villagers, like in terms of the illness, potential cancers, and it destroyed the life of the Buddhist monks and the temples and things, right? So when I was in the States, in California, in San Francisco in particular, there was kind of a peace protest and sort of peace conference there. We're talking about the nature of the military industrial complex, and then the sort of the tech companies in Silicon Valley, and then how it could be harmful for which includes Lockheed Martin and everything, right? I met with a community organizer in California, and then we were talking about these issues, and then out of sort of empathy from my end, what I said was that I know that it's a day-to-day job for people in the United States. So if you're challenging this military industrial complex, and then that meant that, this is really the economy, the kind of national economy that we are talking about in the States. So I know that these workers, they in their daily life, they would not necessarily want to cause harm for the other people, but that they just want to work in their country to bring, bread and butters to their family and such, right? And then when I was talking about this, and then the person who's a community organizer, who's really wanted to see kind of the benefits of this tech industries to be shared with the local community in California, sort of even though that I came with an empathy towards this, and then the person was really adamant and saying, don't mention anything about security or military or anything. We are here to negotiate with the tech company here to have kind of sort of the more equal sort of the share of the benefits for those tech workers in California rather than letting them go away. Right. So from my end, and it was really complicated situation. And then there was other person who really wanted to see this company go. From their side was that they were talking about campus, like they are being called campus there. And then most of these tech people or tech bros, they graduate from a campus and then they move to another campus. And then they don't necessarily understand other people's life and earning millions of dollars in their situation. And then so certain people were saying that we want them to go away because that affects our life in California as well. And then we are talking about ICE and all this, immigrant situation and all very also complicated things were going on. So the reason why I'm mentioning this from kind of the my reference to this thought battery in South Korea and then life of Californians in the States. Everybody has different interest and then different understanding about their identity, which creates huge problems. And then we don't get to really see what's causing what in the different context. And then it affects all of us, not only those people who are in the village near Thought Battery, but also who are an immigrant in California or even the tech bros themselves who may have wanted to develop technology for people with disability. But then, you're nearly facing the bankruptcy if you're just sticking to those points, and then you need subsidy from military industry. So all of these are coming together, creating very complex problem which gives us frustration. However, again, I think these types of conversation, and I'm really glad to sort of meet all of you, and then especially Nate, because I am even more hopeful after this conversation because I know that we all are very much trying to sort of live as human being with kind of I mean, we are all, I think, I'm a Christian myself, so I still believe, still believe that that we are being sort of we are having this image of God with us, and we have the Spirit, and then I think this is the nature of kind of the way in which that we can live, and all these things really artificial out there in the name of certain interest are not necessarily real to my mind, and that's blurring our visions all the time. But when we are being connected like this, and then we are being reminded of the fact that we have shared humanity, and then that's where I think we can really untangle this complicated web of craziness with an artificial way of living, in almost like inhumane way.
Thank you so much. That was a very good note to sort of bring this conversation to a close on. I think, yes, I think sort of going back to my last question in the moderated conversation about what's the unique leadership of young Christians specifically, um, not only are we not necessarily in these boxes that our societies create because we have that younger perspective, we also do come from this Christian perspective where we believe in the image of God in all people, and we believe in walking in the way of Jesus, who uh, teaches us to not not act passively, but to act nonviolently and seek new ways of living and resisting empire, um, as he did. So, thank you all for being here. I'm going to just share a quick slide here for folks who want to scan a QR code to join our movement. And let's see, here we go. All right. So here are our social media as well as a QR code that you can scan to join our email list and get involved with our programs. Coming up, we have a global prayer gathering and as well as a longer event where in March where Nathan and I and the other 3 student leaders who went with us on the trip to Palestine will do a bit more of a deeper dive into our experience and talk about Palestinian liberation theology as well. So I hope that you will all be able to join us for that, and if not, we will hope to record it and share it with those who can't be with us there. And please, yeah, please sign up to be on our email list, follow our social media, and of course, join us at our National Student Conference in April, which you can register for now on our website. We would love to see you there and continue this conversation about learning war no more and resisting violence, imagining new we're imagining a new world with nonviolent ways of living, as we've talked about tonight. So I'd love to see you all there as well. And with that, I will say goodnight to you all and wish you the best going into the rest of the week.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thank you very
Thanks
much.
so
Bye.
much to our
Thank
Thank you.
you.
speakers.
Organizing.